Hello class, today we're going to go over some of the comma rules. So this is the fourth lesson in my sort of video series that I'm doing on some just basic grammar writing mechanics. A comma is not the most important thing in the world when it comes to writing. Having clear, good ideas, good examples, being able to relate to the reader, those are always more important. But understanding some of the comma rules certainly can't hurt. Generally speaking, people break the comma rules into about 7 to 8 rules, although you'll notice that some people organize this a bit differently. Today I'm going to show you how I organize them, and I organize them into about 7 rules. So you'll see that some of them do overlap. Something to note is that commas do help people organize information as they write their sentences. So you don't just use a comma when you want to put a pause. And in fact, that can sometimes lead you to a comma splice, because sometimes you feel like there should be a pause, but really it ought to be a period. But if you use commas correctly and you follow the rules, it actually can make your sentences flow a little bit more smoothly and make them easier for your reader to understand. And if you know the comma rules yourselves, as you're reading, you might find that you're able to dissect and go through the information a little bit more quickly when the author uses the comma rules correctly. So the fact that everybody's sort of on the same page when it comes to the comma rules can be beneficial. So here are the rules in no particular order. We have elements in a series. We have 2 adjectives that describe a noun, introductory elements, interrupters in the middle of a sentence, or even at the end of a sentence. Fanboys, connecting 2 independent clauses together, and if you remember, the fanboys stand for and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Direct quotations, and places and dates when you use multiple elements. So let's see an example of each. So elements in a series: whenever you have 3 or more items in a series, use commas to separate each item. So here's the example. Quentin looked at the sky and dreamt of applesauce, comma, sweet potato pie, comma, and creamed corn. And so notice the comma after each item in the series. You'll also note the comma before the and is optional, but in the next sentence, what happens if we leave the comma out? In class sat a bearded man, comma, a police officer, comma, a woman eating a sandwich, and a parakeet. So what's happening to the parakeet in this sentence? It's possible to interpret the sentence where the woman is not just eating the sandwich, but also eating the parakeet. Okay, so in the next rule, you place a comma whenever you use 2 adjectives that describe a noun, and when you can reverse the 2 adjectives, or if you can put the word and between them. So I have 2 examples here. The first one is we spotted trout in the clear, comma, cold water. You could easily reverse that and say cold and clear water. So that's how you can check to see if you need the comma. And in the next example, I have the clever, opportunistic cat waited for the perfect moment to steal your human's food. As you see, the 2 adjectives are highlighted in orange. You could reverse opportunistic and clever, and you could put the word and between them. Use commas whenever you have an introductory phrase or clause, or even a transition word like however, therefore. Anytime you have an introductory element, place a comma right after the introductory element. And a quick test with this is you can actually leave the word out of the sentence, and the sentence should be perfectly correct. So let's take a look at the first example. In a final ironic twist, comma, the fight turned out to be just one of Alice's visions. And so the first part could be left out. The real sentence is the fight turned out to be just one of Alice's visions. Notice how the subject comes almost immediately after the comma. And that is important to notice, because when the reader sees the comma there, that's how they know that the independent clause is starting. So take a look at the next example. When I had no friend, comma, I made quiet my friend. And so the first part is a adverb clause at the beginning of a sentence, and the subject I comes immediately after the adverb clause and after the comma. And you'll notice that I is the subject of the independent clause. In the next example, Bobby, comma, did you eat my cookie? You'll notice that Bobby is the name of a person that the writer or the author is speaking to. And so whenever you're speaking directly to somebody and you state their name, you should always offset their name by commas, whether it's at the beginning, middle, or end. Here it's at the beginning, so I called this an introductory element. But that's a perfect transition to the next comma rule, which is to use commas around any interrupters in the middle or at the end of a sentence. So interrupters, these are often sometimes referred to as non-restrictive phrases or clauses. So whenever you have extra information that comes in the middle of a sentence or at the end of a sentence, you offset it by 2 commas. And so this really will come in pairs. So it's either 2 commas or no commas for this rule. So use 2 commas around interrupters in the middle of a sentence when the information is not essential to its meaning. So in this first example, Taylor, comma, the girl with the bright green shoes, comma, asked Jordan to the dance. And so you can see the part in orange, the girl with the bright green shoes. That part is in a positive phrase. It's extra information. While very interesting, it could be left out of the sentence. And the sentence makes perfect sense still. So Taylor asked Jordan to the dance would be the independent clause. Notice the next example. My brother, comma, who is a Pokemon master, comma, showed me his favorite Pokemon. Again, the information is extra information. Now, one thing you might notice though is that let's say I had multiple brothers and I needed to know specifically which brother showed me his favorite Pokemon. Well, in that case, the adjective clause, who is a Pokemon master, would be essential. So therefore you wouldn't need the commas. So you use the commas only when it's extra information. So it actually might depend on how many brothers I have. And one quick tip, again, it's going to be 2 commas or no commas. You never want to separate a subject from its verb by just 1 comma. So if you look at the previous example, my brother showed me his favorite Pokemon. If you only put 1 comma there, you would be separating the subject and verb by just 1 comma. And so that's just a quick tip to help you avoid that mistake, because I do see that as a common mistake where people will put 1 comma right at the beginning of the adjective clause or the appositive phrase, but not afterwards. Okay, and then the next rule, you've probably used this rule before. We've practiced this before in class, and I think you're pretty familiar with this one. But some people have some trouble identifying when to use commas with fanboys. And so you tend to use commas with fanboys, the words for and nor but or yet so, whenever you're connecting 2 independent clauses. And the trick here is to just pretend the fanboy isn't there and pretend you're going to put a period there. If you could put a period there and it makes sense, then you should put a comma. But if you couldn't cover up the fanboy and put a period there, then you don't need the comma. So look at the first example. You can have your own beliefs, comma, but you cannot have your own facts. If you put a period there, you can look at each side. You can have your own beliefs, period. You cannot have your own facts, period. Those would stand alone as their own sentences. So I need the comma there. In the next example, without the comma, if you look at the fanboy but, and you just read the second half, cannot have your own facts, that by itself doesn't stand alone. It doesn't have a subject, so you don't put the comma there. Okay, so the next rule is to use a comma whenever you're introducing a direct quote. So in the first example, we have Ricky Bobby's dad says, if you're not first, then you're last. And then in the second example, we have Socrates says, know thyself. And so usually you'll recognize this pretty easily because you'll see the quotations there, and you'll see oftentimes some sort of verb there to indicate that somebody's saying or speaking. Okay, and the last rule is to use commas around places and dates with multiple elements. And so here we have a few examples. In the first one we have, I lived in Moreno Valley, comma, California, comma, since January 2nd, 1998, comma, before it was cool to live here. And so you see the commas around California, and you see the commas around the year. So you put commas around the second element. Let's take a look at the next example. On March 13th, 2020, Moreno Valley College suspended face-to-face classes. And the last example, I attended school at a small college in Moreno Valley, comma, California. And notice in the last example, we only have 1 comma. And the reason we only have 1 comma is because the second element there ends the sentence. So we just put a period. We don't need to put a comma before the period, which is very common sometimes, where you would normally use 2 commas, just like you would with interrupters, but because the interrupter or the element as at the end of the sentence, you just place a period there. Okay, and again, one of the big takeaways is just trying to be clear. Commas are not the most important thing when it comes to the writing process, so they're nothing to be afraid of. But you notice you can interpret the sentence different ways depending on where you put your commas. So you might get this joke that I posted on our Canvas page, which is why I still use the Oxford comma. In the first example with the elements in a series where they use the comma, you can see the eggs, the toast, and the orange juice are all clearly delineated by a comma. But in the second example, it could be interpreted multiple ways. So it could be that the person is telling the toast and orange juice that they had eggs. Okay, so let's give this some practice and see if we can figure out where the commas go and what the rules are. So let's try this one. Let's eat, Grandma. So where would we put a comma here? And this one probably is pretty obvious to you. We should put a comma after eat. And so we're speaking directly to Grandma, and so we're not cannibals. We're not trying to eat Grandma. This isn't a zombie apocalypse, so we're not zombies. So this would be an interrupter at the end of a sentence. And in this case, the comma saves Grandma's life. Okay, let's try this next one. If you found it odd that someone would eat a sandwich and a parakeet, then you should find it odd when someone eats chicken, turkey, or duck. Okay, so where are their commas needed? So you might want to pause this one and give it a try. Okay, so we had two rules here actually. So I've highlighted the first rule in orange and the second rule in pink. The first one is an introductory element. So that first whole part, if you found it odd that someone would eat a sandwich and a parakeet, comma. That's an introductory element. Then the independent clause comes after that. Then you should find it odd when someone eats. And we have a series, chicken, comma, turkey, or duck. So there were two reasons why we needed commas in that sentence. The first was the introductory element, and then the second was the elements in a series. So you can have multiple comma rules happening in a single sentence. Let's try another one that's similar. Okay, so try this one. Pause the video for a second and see if you can figure out where the commas are needed in the following sentence. We live in a world where every statement is contingent, is fallible, is less than perfectly confident, and yet we do not think that the moon is made of green cheese. So take a second to try it and then we'll return. Okay, so you should have found again that there were two rules in this example. So it was actually very similar. We had a series at the beginning. We had contingent, comma, is fallible, comma, and is less than perfectly confident. And then we had the comma and a fanboy connecting two independent clauses. And yet we do not think the moon is made of green cheese. So I highlighted the series in orange and I highlighted the comma and the fanboy in pink. Okay, and let's try one more. Okay, so before you get mad at me, just give it a try and see if you can place the commas in a way that make this sentence sound not so terrible. Okay, so actually, there really is no good way to punctuate this sentence, but this sentence does demonstrate that commas can really matter and can alter the meaning of how you interpret the sentence. So imagine we try the commas here. So if you treat it as an interrupter and you put woman, comma, without her, comma, man is nothing. So without her becoming, two commas around a preposition, then it changes where the subject is because remember, the subject is never inside of a preposition. So the subject becomes man. So man is nothing. And so whereas in the first sentence, it almost sounds like it's saying women are nothing. In the second sentence, it's almost sounding like it's saying men are nothing. And neither of those is perfect or a good sentence, but you can see how commas can drastically alter the meaning of the sentence. So it is something to occasionally check, and it is something worth thinking about.